Hey there, welcome to the Education of a Weaponized Man podcast. Here's this week's question. What does hesitation actually cost?
This podcast exists for one reason: clarity. Clarity about violence, clarity about responsibility, and clarity about what it actually means to be prepared. This is not a show about fighting. It's not about aggression, dominance, or even just tactics. It's about judgment under pressure, restraint when force is justified, and responsibility for consequences of action and inaction. My name is Greg LaBeouf, and I have spent over 3 decades working with men who face violence professionally and men who face it unexpectedly in ordinary lives. But I'm also a father and a husband, and like many of you, I've watched the world change faster than most people are willing to admit. This podcast isn't here to scare you, but it's also not here to reassure you. It's here to help you think clearly about situations that do not allow time for thinking. If you're looking for shortcuts, hype, or entertainment, this is probably not for you. But if you believe preparation is a responsibility, not an obsession, you're in the right place. Let's begin.
All right, this week I want to talk about one thing in particular, and that is decisiveness and the importance of decisiveness in a violent altercation. Okay, now decisiveness is important in many aspects of our lives, but obviously, Education of a Weaponized Man podcast, we're going to talk about it as it pertains to protecting yourself. So I think that there's a lot of confusion because I think a lot of men, when you say decisiveness, they believe that that means acting quickly, right? Oh man, this guy come up, this threat, this situation, there's these guys, whatever it is, and you just act decisively, even in something as maybe slightly more overt in the sense of like 3 o'clock in the morning, you hear somebody trying to break in your house, you got to be decisive, act fast, okay? Now, listen, speed and economy of motion, efficiency, conviction of belief. These are all things that can be connected into decisiveness, and these are all important elements. And so I'm not saying that being decisive doesn't imply or doesn't contain or doesn't, require a certain amount of economy, motion, speed, conviction, all that type of stuff. But where I think a lot of people get confused is this. Being decisive, the 2 parts that I want to make people aware of is timing and judgment. These are critical components to being decisive when it comes to protecting yourself. And so if we just now break these things down, timing and judgment, if you do not have developed, refined, educated judgment, it is going to be much harder for you to be decisive and it'll be almost impossible for you to actually use timing, the other kind of key element, because timing is guided by judgment. So let me break this down. If there's a threat, I have to be using judgment first before I can be decisive. Without judgment, I can't really time, because if I can't judge what's happening, how do I know when my legal right to self-defense is actually activated? How do I know when I'm legally justified in taking a decisive, rapid action? Well, I won't, because I don't have the judgment to judge that. I don't have the judgment to guide me through that. So I can't time it because there's no judgment. So this is where all of a sudden, yes, I'm seeing things are happening, but I'm making an irrational, unjustified judgment, okay? And that's what amateurs do. That's called a reaction. And somebody then after uses the great power of forebrain, rationalization to go, yeah, but he did this. Yeah, but it's like blaming. I had one of my clients. I had a conversation the other day, and he owns his own company and has a number of employees working underneath him. And he said one of his biggest pet peeves is that when somebody does make a mistake, okay, which happened not that long ago, made a mistake, and then he, approached this person about that mistake, their initial visceral response was to automatically blame somebody else. Oh no, it's this person and these guys did this and this company did this. So what he did, and he spent the day, basically had to launch his own little investigation and, went to the different sources and was able to gather irrefutable evidence that they in fact were not responsible for this mistake. And all evidence pointed back to this individual. And he did that not as a way to punishment or I want to be right in this. He did it as a way just to show, listen, humans make mistakes. I don't care that you made a mistake, but all you needed to do was to just own the mistake, learn from the mistake, and we move forward from the mistake. If you're going to continuously make that mistake, then yes, then you're no longer employable. But it's not a matter of if we make mistakes. So why I share that little story is because that's what happens to people. Things are happening in a violent situation, stuff's happening, and we're making judgments. And then we're being decisive in our actions. The problem is those are not necessarily defendable, and those are not necessarily morally correct decisions. So those decisions have consequences that you cannot take back. Okay, and so that is going to impact not only your life, but potentially many other people's lives, right? Your family, you get locked up and thrown in jail because you were decisive, right? You were a man, you took swift action, but you had horrible frickin' judgment because you had no training. So decisiveness without judgment, and decisiveness without judgment, meaning then there's no timing or improper timing, is not good. Some very bad things are going to happen from that. So one of the major goals in our training is to start weaponizing judgment. And how do you do that? Okay, well, what allows you to determine something? What gives you judgment? Well, obviously, line familiarization, experience, domain knowledge. So this is why we teach what we call the bad guy blueprints. We teach violent behavior. Understand something. Most people will say that violence is random, or well, there's examples of random violence. Oh, there was a random assault here. There's a random act of violence. He became the victim of a random act of violence. Understand something. Violence is never random. There is always at least one person that understands exactly what's going on, and many times that's the violent criminal. So it is only random to the victim of that situation because they never expected it. They don't understand it. Listen, you live in a world where violence exists. And maybe you're blessed to live in a part of the world or in a city or a country or a neighborhood where you go, violence is just so rare. I'm in my 50s, 60s, 40s, and I've never experienced aggression or violence from another human being. Great. You're blessed and you're lucky, and maybe you go another 30, 40, 50 years and you never experience violence. That's great. But for many people, we experience violence. We see violence, aggression on lots of different levels. And so if you just accept the reality of that, then you make a decision. Well, do I want to be prepared or don't I? If you say I want to, then you start educating and studying violence. So you understand violent behavior. You understand the motivations and the actions. Criminals, they want something. They have objectives. They have a system for how they successfully rape, assault, and murder people. This is not foreign to people. We understand there's a term called grooming. Child predators groom their victims often. So they have a process. And they've refined the process. Well, do you think someone who rapes, do you think someone who assaults, do you think somebody who murders, whether that's for drugs or whether that's part of gang activity or whatever that is, people think there's no system. Well, there is. There's a process. And when you can study the process and be taught the process and understand the process, you start going, oh, look, they have objectives. They're literally trying to, they're working a process. It is so much easier when you do that, when you start understanding that, because then you go, okay, well, now we can attack their objectives. Like we have countermeasures for these things. Well, you're starting to refine your judgment. Then just let's take that a step further and go, well, you start teaching people about the pre-incident indicators, right? Start teaching them the body language, the behavioral indexes or indicators, and the interpersonal communication. You start teaching people how to read the factual signs that demonstrate escalation, aggression, and violence in other human beings. So if we just took those two areas of study, violent criminal behavior, the bad guy blueprints, and studying and understanding the pre-incident indicators, the body language, the behavioral patterns, and interpersonal communication cues, if you started just to understand those two areas of study, what happens to a man's judgment? Well, two things. One is it becomes grounded in factual, reality-based information, not guesses, speculation, and visceral emotional reactions to things. So now all of a sudden you have somebody who's facing a situation who's seen all of these things. these factual, educated, experiential indicators that are not only morally defendable for us, meaning I know why I took the actions that I took, but they are legally defendable in a court of law, where everybody is so fond of saying that self-defense is illegal. It's not illegal. You just bear the responsibility to be able to articulate why you did what you did. There's the burden there. You have to understand what activates your right to self-defense, okay? So now all of a sudden you have judgment. Educated, weaponized, grounded judgment. Now you can have timing. Because what are you timing? You are timing all of these little things. It is not just what the person says. It is maybe how they say it. It is how they're standing. It is the proximity. It is the environment. It is the physiological indicators. It is all of these different things that are now happening that you're witnessing. And these things can be happening at a very, very rapid pace. All of this can be happening in fractions of seconds, or they can be happening over a few minutes, or a few hours, or a few weeks, or a few days, or a few months. Like aggression and violence can percolate over long periods of time. This is when you have aggression and violence in the workplace or in the schools or whatever it is. It's not all just about rapidly, evolving, assaults that are happening in fractions of a second out on the street. There's different levels to this. There's different, layers to this. But you have this judgment where you are now able to read these indicators, and that is when then you can activate timing. You can time something. So if we talk about timing, let's set a general parameter here. You can time something on the preparation of something, AOP, attack on preparation. You can time it on the development, AOD, attack on development, or AOC, attack on completion. So meaning if you're well trained and you have really good judgment, you can see the preparation of aggression, violence, building. Now, you might not be in this moment on the preparation. You might not be facing imminent grievous bodily harm or death, but that does not mean that you cannot time decisive action on the preparation or the development, the earliest indicators of some form of aggression happening. Just your decisive action, the timing you implement might be, and most likely in most cases can be, the ability or the option to remove yourself from that situation, to begin to work to de-escalate the situation long before it builds to a crisis situation. Now that's a decisive action. But I think for a lot of people, it's like a lot of men maybe think that decisiveness equates to that speed of response. And so they might be feeling, witnessing, experiencing the formation of a threat, and their decisive action is they nail the guy in the face, or they, whatever they do. They take a decisive physical action, which all of a sudden now can potentially and most likely be deemed to be overly aggressive. Okay, where you could end up again facing consequences for that action. It doesn't mean that you were wrong, that something may in fact have been building, but your decisive, aggressive reaction to what is in the preparation stage might be deemed too much. Your action potentially should have been, and maybe could have been, to remove yourself from that situation. Or you might see the indicators that tell you it is now in development. So the risk is more imminent. The risk is becoming more grievous. Maybe we can remove ourselves. Maybe we can't. It would depend on the judgment and what the indicators that you're witnessing are. This is what you would have to understand. This is what you'd have to be able to articulate to your defense team, to your lawyer, to build a case on why you did something, why your decisive action was tactical, why you engaged that threat at that moment with that level of force. Why did you do that? Well, that is your judgment. Your judgment will be examined. Your judgment will be questioned. Your judgment will be prosecuted. And so that is what must stand up. Okay? Now, of course, if we have trained judgment and we see, just for clarity, you can see indicators that inform your judgment at early stages of just preparation of an impending assault. So they are in the very early stages. They have not physically attacked you yet. But you can see indicators at the very earliest stage of preparation that could and should warrant decisive tactical responses from you. Just as equally as you could see the early indicators that tell you to remove, de-escalate, or deter. Because the escalation from a preparation of an assault to the execution of assault can happen as fast as you can blink. Not always, but it can. So again, this is the fluidity of combat. If all violent assaults went through a definitive time frame, meaning there's 30 seconds of preparation followed by 20 seconds of development, and then we end up in the execution phase to pass the point of no return. Like if it all happened that way, then you'd have a different way of training, but it doesn't happen that way. Some violent assaults have minutes, days, weeks, months of buildup of prep, where things are changing and there are signs that this is escalating and all that stuff, but it happens over a long period of time, or it can happen over a short period of time. So the point is simply being that this is where, again, we come back to educating the judgment, because you have to be able to judge in that moment or in those fractions of seconds. Where am I at? What are we doing? What is the decisive action that I need to take? And hopefully what the picture I'm starting to paint for people is how dangerous reactions are. Listen, human beings are emotional creatures. We feel things first. So when you even have the potential of a threat, something in its earliest embryonic stages of development, you can have a response to that. You can have an emotional reaction to that. And then that feeling can fuel your thoughts, and those feelings and thoughts impact your actions. And you can do something, again, that you were just quite simply using fouled judgment. And our judgment is susceptible to that when it is untrained and unrestrained and uneducated and unexperienced in this specific context. Okay, so timing and decisiveness, to me, absolutely starts with educating someone's judgment, which starts with giving them domain knowledge that they most likely have never been given access to. And that's the stuff that I mentioned earlier, the blueprints, the pre-incident indicators. Of course, there's more. It's not just those two areas, but I'm just using that for the point of simplicity. Once you develop that judgment and you educate that judgment, which again, you're dealing with imperfect information happening often faster than decision-making capabilities, like it's happening so fast. But that's why the training is non-negotiable. Like you can't just hope or expect that type of judgment that will be scrutinized, that will be prosecuted, is just naturally there. That it just has nothing to do with how big and strong someone is, or how hard they can punch or kick, or how many years they've spent grappling on a mat, or whatever it is. Okay, kicking a bag, hitting focus mitts, sparring, just that does not lend itself fully to developing the judgment and timing of somebody who is the protector for themselves and their family, for someone who carries that burden of responsibility. Okay, so that's kind of it. The only other area of this is, and I think I've spoken about this in so many other podcast episodes that I'm not going to go deep in this, but it's the opposite of decisiveness is hesitation. And so it's the exact same thing. What causes hesitation under pressure? Well, somebody's judgment is not there. Their brain is, I don't like, they don't know what they're seeing. They don't know how they should respond to it or react to it, or it's all happening and they have no reference point, no domain knowledge, no experience. So they hesitate because they don't know what to do. And so you're just dealing with this, you know, timing and decisiveness is absolutely a byproduct of really good training. I don't see how, well, that's not true. I was going to say, I don't see how a man develops really, I was going to say world class, but you don't even need it necessarily to be world class. But how does a man develop? I don't see how a man develops really strong, grounded, foundational judgment so that he can be decisive in his timing of action, which might be removing yourself or whatever needs to be done, without training. But to be fair, I have met a number of individuals that just through life experience, growing up in, for some of them, war-torn countries, for others, growing up in extremely violent and abusive, whether that's immediate family situations, neighborhoods, environments, where they develop they have great intuition. They have a great ability to read human interactions very, very well. They have really good judgment, and they trust it, and they're decisive, and their timing is really, really strong. But again, so they did receive training of sorts, and that was through life. And the thing that I would caution against is a lot of men go, yeah, I have that. Their life has been filled with a tremendous amount of failure. I have never met somebody who's developed like a trained and restrained, weaponized judgment that had, like, it's cost them a lot. If they gain that through life experience, it is because they have failed and had to course correct. They have learned some very, very hard lessons. But what I can tell you is that you can develop that type of really functional, solid, foundational judgment. Like, you can develop, that can be trained where it doesn't have to cost you. You don't have to lose. You don't have to fail. You don't have to pay the consequences, suffer the consequences to develop that type of a skill set. It can be trained. The knowledge is there, the training methodology is there, and it can be passed on and transferred to people. And that's the way you want to go. I always, differentiate it this way. You have in your life lessons that you've learned, and you have lessons that you've earned. And the lessons that you've earned always come at a cost. The most valuable lessons that you have earned, you have done it through suffering. You have done it through failure, right? You've gotten that feedback. The lessons that you've learned, especially if you're wise, you learn from other people's earned lessons. You witness it, you study it, mentors have passed it down onto you. You have put in the tremendous amount of work to not just intellectually understand their lessons, because that everyone says that I got that. You have internalized their lessons to the point that it is if you have almost lived them yourself. You believe them. They are anchored. They become your paradigms. They become your North Star. You can learn lessons like that and avoid having to earn every single lesson like that. And that is massive.
If you've listened this far, take a moment before moving on, not to agree with anything that I've said, but to notice what stayed with you. These conversations aren't meant to provide answers that you can memorize. They're meant to sharpen your judgment, to clarify your responsibility, and to help you think clearly about moments that don't allow time for thinking. If this episode raised questions, that's the point. If it made you more cautious rather than confident, that's a good thing. And if it didn't resonate with you, you don't need to force it. Preparation is personal, and it has to align with who you are and what you're responsible for. You don't need to do anything after this. Just carry the questions with you and pay attention to how you see the world this week. We'll continue the conversation next time.